All right, so welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Forest Defender session working on for the non-human world. This event is co-sponsored by the Faculty Commons and is part of Bellevue College's Earth Week, where we're exploring topics around the theme of climate voices, sharing, listening, and taking action together, which centers the importance of conversation, storytelling, and the sharing of knowledge as a powerful tool to spark action and build hope for a sustainable and just future. So my name is Alyssa Gordon. I am from the Office of Sustainability at Bellevue College. We have a great lineup of events this week, so I highly encourage everyone to take a look at the schedule I posted in the chat and attend any events today and Friday. This event is unique because it is hybrid, so we have both an in-person audience and a Zoom audience. Had some of the technical difficulties. So for the audience members in Zoom, stay on mute, please, and put any comments or questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat there and reading any questions for our speaker during the Q&A portion. Please make sure to be kind and respectful in the chat. And another thing to note is that we will be recording this session to be posted on the sustainability website later for a resource. Before we get started, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. So we pause to acknowledge that Bellevue College resides on the traditional and occupied land of the Coast Salish peoples, past, present, and future. That includes, but is not limited to, Snoqualmie, Suquamish, Suwamish, Nisqually, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot. We honor their connection to the region, pay respect to Coast Salish elders, past and present, and stand in solidarity through their struggles with continued systemic oppression. We commit to care for the land and water and center equity at the core of our learning. All right, now I will introduce our speaker for today's session, Joshua Wright. So Joshua is an 18-year-old environmental activist and filmmaker. He is an organizer with the Rainforest Flying Squad, a direct action group dedicated to defending old growth forests. In 2020, he helped launch the Fairy Creek Blockades, which have become the largest active civil disobedience in Canadian history. Multiple articles and interviews have been published on this topic in the Seattle Times, the Guardian, the New York Times, and the Globe and Mail, just to name a few sources. So without further ado, help me in welcoming Joshua. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm here to talk about our rainforests. My name is Joshua Wright, and I'm an organizer with the Rainforest Flying Squad, and I'm a forest defender. So as a kid, I was obsessed with forests. I lived abroad. My parents worked for the embassy, and we were from Washington. Every time we'd come home for the summer, I'd go exploring the timberlands around my home, go exploring the national forest, and to say the least, I was obsessed. I wrote a 260-some page book on trees. It was mostly citing Wikipedia, so it didn't ever get published. Of course, I was 14, but that kind of shows you where I'm coming from. I was a tree nerd, to say the least. When you're a tree nerd, you find pictures of stumps like these. This is a 4,000-year-old redwood stump that was discovered that was logged in Field Brook, California, which is near Eureka. And it was cut down in a drunken bet between two rich people, who one of which owned the tree, saying that they could make a circular table out of one tree that could seat 40 people. And it's gone today, and needless to say, we don't have any trees like that anymore. And it's one thing to see pictures like this and think about humanity's folly and think, oh my God, how could we have ever done that? We must save whatever we have left. But it's an entirely different thing to see pictures like these. 4K pictures. This tree was cut in 2020 of logging that is taking place now and is continuing at a rapid pace to the extent where we are destroying an entire ecosystem at this point. And there's no excuse for it. We can't say it was in the past, it's happening right now. So in British Columbia, the vast majority of old growth forests have been cut down, and the BC government is continuing to sanction logging of some of the last and biggest trees in the world. A stump like this would be about 1,000 years old, and trees that they're cutting down in British Columbia are up to 2,000 years old. And they're being cut down because a tree like that's worth about 20 to 100 grand. So logging companies essentially in a liquidation process of the biggest and best trees. And it's essentially mining forests, because trees like that, they never, they grow back in 1,000 years. So on Vancouver Island, around 80% of old growth forests have been clear cut. And across the province, it's actually an even worse situation, especially when you focus on the biggest treed areas like that you can see in this picture, where the trees grow to be like up to 20 feet thick. And increasingly, they are getting the best, or cutting the best, then the best of the rest, then the best of the rest of the rest. And in a couple of years, trees like this will be almost extinct in British Columbia. They're currently logging over 120,000 acres of old growth forest every year. And that's equivalent to an area the size of Seattle, Bainbridge Island, and Bellevue combined. So that's what's being lost every year as far as old growth forests up in British Columbia. This is a map that shows the original primary forests of British Columbia in this southern coast on Vancouver Island. And this is what it looked like in 2012. And keep in mind, since 2012, we've lost close to 1 million acres of old growth. So this was what it looked like 10 years ago. You know, as someone who lived overseas and couldn't be in these forests a lot of my life, you know, my parents worked at the embassy, I would track the logging of these forests on satellite imagery. That image that I showed you of the before and after, it was logged in this clear cut in 2020, 2019 time period. And, you know, using satellite imagery, you're able to track exactly, you know, which areas are lost. So one after another, after another, after another. So you can see, you know, area after area gutted. Generally, they target the biggest trees, the most intact areas, the valley bottoms. And then they go for the mountaintops. You can see these roads making up the sides of the mountains. And those trees would be about a foot thick, but they're going after them anyway, and essentially converting a living ecosystem into a farm. So about a year and a half ago, I saw this image. And this image is, this is the Fairy Creek watershed in the middle. And you can see on each side, they're building roads from the bottom, from the top, and from the side. That top road right here was headed for the intact headwaters of Fairy Creek, which is the largest unprotected old growth forest on southern Vancouver Island. And at the time wasn't really well known. And I saw that image and it kind of my heart sunk, and I was like, you know, not this place too. And I started talking to every single person I knew about this place. I was sort of depressed. You know, the climate's changing, you know, climate catastrophes are coming, and BC is about to log one of its last intact valleys. And to put it into perspective, this intact valley has never seen any logging in history. So it's been pretty much untouched since time immemorial. This valley is located on southern Vancouver Island on Pachidat territory. And when I saw this logging going ahead, you know, friends started talking, and turns out there was an entirely different group of people organizing. You know, this is a shot of this valley, and you can kind of see pretty easily why it's worth fighting for. And there was a group that was calling themselves the Rainforest Flying Squad that wanted to blockade these areas. So people went and started exploring this valley, you know, around August, and a few days later, they found this tree, which is a 2,000-year-old yellow cedar tree that's at the headwaters of Fairy Creek, and was in the path of the approved road building. A company called Teal Jones wanted to cut it down and turn it into shingles of all things, this and the surrounding forest, and essentially build these roads which would facilitate the liquidation of this entire upper watershed. And it's sort of an emblematic area, you know, one intact forests that are being converted into tree farms, and people decided that enough was enough. So a few days after visiting the area for the first time, people set up a road blockade on the top of the mountain at about 3,000 feet. There were about 24 people there. And this was in the middle of COVID. So I was not there because the Canadian border was closed. But people decided that enough was enough. It had been about 30 years since there was any meaningful direct action up in British Columbia. And people were ready to give it another go, essentially. So using satellite imagery, we were able to track down where the company was logging. You know, there are services that update satellite imagery on a daily basis. So we could see exactly where the company was starting to build roads, and then we could go and stop them, which was the idea behind the Rainforest Flying Squad, like, you know, stopping them wherever they popped up. So we'd set up blockades all across the region, and the message was essentially that enough was enough. Eventually, the logging company got, basically put out of business. So they went to the courts, and the courts gave them an injunction, which brought in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and they started arresting land defenders by the hundreds. So this started at about April last year, and it's been going on ever since. The policing enforcement essentially looks something like this. Land defenders will dig trenches, sit in tripods, sit in trees, do whatever they can to sort of slow down logging trucks, block the roads, whether it's sitting, playing a game of cat and mouse with the loggers and like running behind the trees and trying to stop them from cutting them down, or it's digging trenches like this one. People were peacefully by the hundreds coming to the front lines, coming to the forest and defending the land. And they were being met with the middle picture, a militarized response of police hiding their identity, hiding their badges, wearing thin blue line patches, and brutalizing people. People were pepper sprayed, people were assaulted by cops, and eventually 1,188 people were arrested last year. And we still don't know how many people are going to be arrested this year, but it's safe to assume that a lot will be because the action's continuing. In fact, yesterday, they set up their first tripod in the road of the season to block hauling of ancient trees out of the forests around Fairy Creek. So Elder Bill Jones, who is a Pacheedaht elder of the land and has embraced the blockades, describes old growth forests as the last intimate places in our souls. These forests aren't just important for their carbon value, they're important for the culture of the Pacheedaht community, for the culture of every single person who wants to have a relationship with nature. You can see in the background of this image, in the distance, that's the old growth forest that the blockades have been defending for a while at Upper Granite Creek, which is just across the ridge from Fairy Creek. And you can see in the back, there's a paddy wagon there that no doubt had peaceful land defenders in it, driving people out. And then this is a circle, an area called Red Dress that was created to as a memorial to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which is very closely tied with the resource extraction industry. And in total, to put into perspective, the RCMP have spent $1 million enforcing the injunction, or $10 million, $10 million enforcing the injunction at Fairy Creek, which is about as much as the timber is worth. And our essential argument for is that these old growth forests, even apart from their spiritual value, are literally worth more standing. This tree in this picture was cut down 2 weeks ago, and the companies will be able to essentially get a hell of a lot of money per cut block. So in this cut block, they no doubt made $5 to $10 million simply off of this about 60-acre area, and that was near Fairy Creek. But if you leave forests like these standing, they have tremendous value. So scientists say that there's more biodiversity per square inch in forests of the Pacific Northwest than any other ecosystem in the world, except maybe the Amazon. In 1 footprint in an old growth forest, they say that there are 60,000 vertebrates or invertebrate species living in that patch of soil. They have incredibly deep soils, going several meters deep. The canopies of old growth forests are home to endangered species like the marbled murrelet, spotted owl, western screech owl, that can only live in complex canopies with platforms. If you look at the top of an old growth tree, it's not simply a straight line. They have branches sticking out, birds nest on those branches, all sorts of different habitat features that you simply cannot replicate. And of course, they have trees like these that are just out of this world in terms of spiritual value and cultural value. Cedar stripping. This is a western red cedar, and this tree is also in an approved or in the path of approved road building, and is currently the company Western Forest Products that has tenure to this area is currently applying to get that tree cut down. So you can kind of see how morally reprehensible that is on a gut level, and then beyond that, on a climate level. Dr. Suzanne Sinward of UBC estimates that there are 526 tons of carbon per acre of forest around Fairy Creek. And she wrote the book Finding the Mother Tree, and is one of the lead scientists in mycorrhizal networks that these forests have, where the trees literally talk to each other. And yeah, there's the carbon stored in the trees, and then there's the carbon stored in the soil. And the carbon stored in the soil is massive, and when you clear cut it, the vast majority of it's released. In Washington State, turning south, this is actually the website of one of the biggest timber companies in the state. And their argument around carbon is that they sequester a lot of it. They have actually a running calculator in the corner of their website showing exactly how much carbon their land sequester ever since 1990 in this case. And to say the least, that's greenwashing. When you clear cut a forest, whether it's second growth or old growth, around 60% of the carbon is released immediately upon clear cutting, according to Suzanne Simard. And that's true whether it's in British Columbia or Washington State. And you might be wondering why we're switching down to Washington State, and it's because we're in the same ecosystem as forests in British Columbia. It's just that down here, the situation is even more dire. Right now, logging companies down here are running rampant with under the brand of sustainable forestry, and they are clear cutting third and fourth growth forests. We don't have very much old growth anymore. We have almost none of it, in fact. And companies are currently logging most of the land base of Western Washington State in cycles that are about 20 to 40 years, and trees that are about this big. West of the Cascades, there are a lot of timberlands, to say the least. There are about 5 million acres of private timberlands, 1.5 million acres of state-owned timberlands, 2 million acres of federal timberlands, and federal timberlands are a bit better managed. They aren't clear-cut, but state and private lands are pretty much managed solely for timber on a clear-cut rotation. And then there's a small portion of public lands that are also owned by local governments and generally clear-cut on short rotations as well. So that's the situation down here. All of the forests in Washington State used to be as productive and as beautiful as those sorts of forests that are now only really found on Vancouver Island and along the coast, not in Washington State, for instance, unless you're in a national park. And in Washington State, we used to have some of the biggest trees in the world. And now these, you can see on the picture, the yellowish one that was taken in Tacoma, Washington, and you can picture what Tacoma looks like now. The other pictures were taken in Mineral, Washington, and in fact, the tallest tree in the world used to be in Washington. It was over 400 feet tall. It was a Douglas fir, not a redwood, and you can probably guess what happened to it. This is what Washington State looks like now. This is a second growth plantation forest. You can see that there's almost no light. There's almost no habitat structures. If you were a bird, like you can imagine where you nest in that, you'd have to practically build your nest on the ground and get eaten to live in that forest. There's very little foliage. There's very little species diversity. And this is what managed plantations look like. And that's what the vast majority of the forests in Washington and also these days in British Columbia are turning into. Timber companies don't, they know that logging old forests aren't sustainable. So in British Columbia, they're transitioning, and down here they have transitioned to logging forests like these, turning them into 2x4s and pulp if they're lucky, and on each rotation degrading the soils. Suzanne Simard, who's on one of the other slides, sort of explained to me this way. You can think of an old growth forest as having like a meter of soil. A second growth forest will have this much, a foot. A third growth forest will have a few inches. A fourth growth forest will have an inch. A fifth growth forest might not have any. And, you can see how these forests could recover if you left them alone. If you think about these massive productive forests, like that huge tree that I showed you on the other slide, that tree grew from essentially what is glacial moraine, so the remnants from glaciers. So they didn't have there wasn't a lot of abundance where they started out. So they clearly have the ability to come back. But the first step to letting forests like these come back into old growth is to stop the destruction. The first step to restoration is to stop the destruction and let these forests actually recover, let species return to these areas, and most importantly, let the trees get big and let the trees get old, and that's going to take a really long time. And in my perspective, if it's going to take a really long time, we better start now. We live in the Puget Lowland Forest. Seattle is in the Puget Lowland Forest, and I don't think most people know what ecoregion that they actually are living in. But the Puget Lowland Forest essentially goes from Portland up to Desolation Sound on, like, north of Vancouver Island or west of Vancouver, or east of Vancouver Island. And if you read the WWF, ecosystem profile, it's pretty damning. It's these are some quotes from it. Fragmentation has been extensive throughout the region. Almost no native habitat remains. Small isolated islands of original habitat surrounded by urbanization and agriculture. The remaining forests have been largely converted to tree farms, which we saw on the last slide, or exist in small state parks. So our ecosystem is in quite dire shape. And the ecosystems of the world are in quite dire shape. The United Nations is telling us that about 1 million species are going to go extinct in the coming decades, which is more than ever before in human history. This bird right here is a key example of that. That's a marbled murrelet, and it's sitting on a moss-covered branch of a Douglas fir. And second growth forests don't have branches like that. It takes hundreds and hundreds of years to develop those sorts of habitats. And their populations are crashing right now. In Fairy Creek, there are around 115 marbled murrelets that live in that forest. And the government sees that, and they acknowledge that, and then they let the logging companies cut them down. So we are in an ecological crisis, and we need to both stop the destruction that's happening to our original old growth forests and for our second growth forests, which are more relevant down here because that's all we really have, second and third and fourth growth forests. We need to see them restored. So there are, if you add up those totals of forests I showed you a minute ago, there's about 9.5 million acres of forests in Western Washington that are clear cut on a continual basis. And there's about 500 tons of carbon per acre in the forest around Fairy Creek. You could lowball that and say more like 200, meet in the middle and say about 600 or 364. And if you multiply that on, it should say per acre. Whoops. If you multiply that out, you get 3.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide that could be stored in Western Washington forests alone if we were to restore this ecosystem. And if we were to do that, that would be equivalent to over 35 years of Washington State's emissions sequestered. So if you think about a climate imperative, that's one if I ever saw one. But a good place to start is Washington State's public lands. So this is a map of lands that are managed by the Department of Natural Resources, which is a wing of the Washington State government, and they own a great deal of lands which are managed in a state trust system. The trust lands essentially are clear cut to fund rural schools, county governments, and colleges in some cases. So this one actually probably does receive funding from Washington State trust lands. But as a young person, I personally do see a bit of irony in the government clear-cutting public lands to pay for education. It's like destroying one's future to fund one's future. But it's an easy place to start. If we restored, Washington State's public lands, that is a substantial amount of carbon restored. That's a substantial amount of wildlife habitat protected. And the political climate for doing that is actually pretty easy. Of the public lands, there are about 63,000 acres of forest that are 100 plus years old, and these are known as legacy forests. And right now, the Washington State government is auctioning them off at a rapid clip. This was taken in what was called the Tip Top Timber Sale, the Rensland Creek Forest, which is in Mason County, which is on the Olympic Peninsula. And it was clear cut a couple years ago. And the community was dead set against it. But the argument of the DNR is, hey, we're funding rural schools. You can't criticize that. And I actually went to my local school board meeting recently, and my school district got a grand total of $40,000 from all the logging. So it's not actually a lot of money. It really isn't. And when you compare that to the ecological value and the community value of having large protected areas in the region, that has tremendous potential. This forest was located around the Great Bend of the Hood Canal, which is actually a area that marble murrelets are known to live in. They don't live in the forest around it because all of the forests have been clear cut and there's no nesting habitat anymore, but they live in the waterways because they're a seabird. Were they to leave this forest standing, it would only take another 100 years or so for it to become suitable habitat for the marble murrelet and actually have species return to these areas and have biodiversity thrive and have sort of the line going in the right direction instead of the wrong direction again. Unfortunately, they didn't do that on that particular timber sale, but there's still a chance. The best thing you can do is, there's the proverb, the best thing to do is plant a tree 20 years ago, the second best time is now. Well, the best thing to do is not cut them down to begin with. So right now we have remaining legacy forests to around 60,000 acres. They're being auctioned off every year. And we have a great deal of other forests that give them 50 years would be legacy forests, and give them another 50 years after that would become old growth forests. So the potential for restoration is there, even though logging is continuing. This is a tree that was in the Chameleon timber sale, which was near Olympia. And that tree was cut down last year after a small group set up a blockade trying to stop the logging. It essentially fell through. The police cracked down pretty quickly and that area was clear cut. But this is what we're losing. We may not have any old growth anymore, but we really should learn from the lessons of the past and protect what we have that is still old. Right now, as an organizer with the Fairy Creek Blockades, I look at the political situation in Washington State and I am kind of jealous because in Canada, the timber industry owns the government. Like they own the regulatory system. It's the fox guarding the hen house. They are in bed with the premier. It's a very politically complicated situation up there. The First Nations get paid off by the government, and the government is super supportive of the timber industry because they got contributions from the timber industry. And one of the biggest funders to the NDP party, which is the one that is sanctioning the logging right now, are unions of forestry workers. So it's a very politically charged situation in a province that essentially runs on timber. But in Washington State, we have the climate governor, so he says, and we have Hillary Franz, who is angling to become governor of a state that is largely made up of people who are opposed to logging, who work in the city and don't actually want to see, don't need to see the forest clear cut as resources and don't want to see that either. Right now, our forests in Washington State are being managed largely by several corporations that do not employ very many people. Weyerhaeuser owns around several million acres of land in Washington State. And they essentially have their gated plantations. You are not allowed to get in unless you buy a permit that costs at least $500. And they manage their forests essentially as commodities. And it really doesn't do anything for the state, to put it plainly. There are several other logging companies that are owned by private individuals. Like Sierra Pacific Industries is one of them. They own multi-million acres, and they're essentially oligarchs of America. They own large amounts of land. They're not publicly traded. They're not publicly accountable in any way. And they do not benefit the state very much. And right now, as you saw in that carbon slide, they're doing their damnedest to say, we're the solution. Logging forests works. It's sustainable, it's green, the trees grow back, we sequester carbon. Their argument is they sequester carbon in timber products. But as you saw in those other slides, when you log a forest, about 60% of the carbon is released immediately upon clear cutting. And you saw that massive pile of essentially debris. Those are all burned, which goes directly into the atmosphere and leaving everything denuded. Logging creates a home for invasive species. With hotter and drier summers, a lot of the species that they're planting might not even be able to grow in the coming years. And the industry is really trying to make itself look really good to politicians, but they're only succeeding because they're not being really opposed. So if we were to have even a 10% of the resistance that's happened up at Fairy Creek, if we were to have 100 arrests trying to end logging on public lands, it would probably work. And it's a kind of a no-brainer to think that logging our last forests on continue as commodities instead of having them as lands that the public can use, that salmon can use, that marble murrelets can use. It's not an argument that's it's kind of a no-brainer. It's not really hard for people to understand. And it's not only a climate imperative that we do this, it's an ecological imperative. You know, we are in the midst of the sixth extinction. You can see on one side of this image, there is a picture of parts of the Olympic National Forest that essentially looks like a rainforest. It's part of the Amazon. And a lot of people don't realize that we live in a rainforest. It's quite something that, you know, countries of the global north will criticize Brazil for logging. And in the meantime, most of our lands look like that other side of the image. That's a Weyerhaeuser managed plantation, which is clear cut every 50 years or so. We can have a rainforest again if we restored these, you know, the tracts of timberlands that are right now being managed as timberlands instead of as a rainforest. If we restored them using ecoforestry, you'd get jobs in the restoration. You could still log to some capacity, but not to the capacity that they do today. You know, we could try to manage our ecosystem as a rainforest that essentially goes from Haines all the way down to the redwoods. So from Alaska to the redwoods. And that's what it was, the coastal temperate rainforests of British Columbia, Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and California were some of the most spectacular forests in the world. And we spent 200 years pillaging them. And the results are obvious. Like, this is why we are in a climate crisis. This is why we are in the sixth extinction event. And at a time when at such a late hour, industries are trying to talk out of both sides of their mouth. They're saying, okay, yeah, you think clear cutting is bad? Actually, clear cutting is great. It's sort of Orwellian. It's like, we're just gonna co-opt the term sustainable. We're gonna say clear cutting is great for the environment, and we're gonna make people believe it. And if there's nobody challenging that, then they can get away with it. You know, these lands like these, that's what is considered sustainable forestry. If you look at the back of your bag and you see Sustainable Forestry Initiative, that's what that looks like. It's not sustainable, and it will never be sustainable. Action, like what's happened in Fairy Creek, if it happened down here, it could help recreate our coastal rainforest. And personally, I see that as, it's not an option. We have to do it. And then this is, whether you care about people or you care about the birds or you care about the salmon, restoring our forests is the only option. You know, we can't live in a climate crisis. There are no jobs if they're on a dead planet. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's true. And if we did restore our forests, we could have a great, like we could have, you know, communities that are employed by restoring our forests. You know, it takes a lot of work to turn a plantation into a rainforest. We could have schools that, you know, what if we viewed forests as a resource for schools instead of a resource for schools? You know, not an area to clear cut and destroy and turn into 2-buck forests and sell them and get enough revenue for about half a teacher's salary. Or what if we saw them as a place where kids could learn about the natural world and learn to be connected to the natural world and learn to fight for the natural world? So there's a lot of promise if we acted. And I guess my plea to you is to act. So if you want to stay up to date on the Fairy Creek Blockades, that's the Instagram handle. Saving Legacy Forests, the handle is Center Responsible Forestry, and that's the Center for Responsible Forestry, who's suing on a lot of these timber sales and trying to get a lot of them canceled. And if you want to keep up to date with forest defense actions down here, you can follow my personal Instagram, and I will be updating people as, you know, hopefully a movement grows down here. Right now it's early days, but there's a lot of potential if we did act. And I hope that this has been informative, and I hope that it's kind of convincing you to act. So I'm happy to take any questions or whatever you want to know. If you want to know more about Fairy Creek, I can go into that forever. I'm an organizer, so there's a lot of, like, you know, drama and stuff that I can talk about, but there's tons of different things.
So far we have one question in the chat from Erica. She was wondering to learn more about salmon, how that deals with all of this. And she said she might have heard wrong, but wanted a little bit more explanation about the connection to salmon.
Yeah, so a lot of, you know, if you listen to like a lot of the teachings of indigenous tribes up and down the coast, like they will often say the rainforest is like salmon are the rainforest, because the way, you know, I don't know how, you know, to what degree people are familiar with the way salmon breed, but they climb up the rivers, if there's not any dams in the way, and they go up in these feeder streams. And in these streams in the mountains, bears will basically feast on salmon, and their carcasses will essentially line the edges of the river. And it kind of is a bit disgusting when you're there, rotting salmon everywhere. You don't think that's super good, but they actually are a biotic pump that pumps nutrients from the ocean up into these ecosystems, and is in part why these trees grow so big and so rich. And clear cut logging, when they clear cut an area, that puts a lot of silt in the streams, makes it really hard for salmon to actually go into these areas. And that, and combined with dams, are causing a lot of localized extinction of salmon species. So in the Puget Sound specifically, salmon are in dire straits. There's a lot of organizations that are trying to combat that, especially with riparian area restoration, so like restoring the riverbeds. But yeah, this rainforest is essentially a salmon rainforest. That's how so much nutrients get into these areas, and that's why the trees grow so big in part. So it's kind of you wouldn't think that the trees are big because salmon, but that's in large part why these areas are so rich and have so many nutrients, is because salmon go up these streams, are eaten by bears, and just feed the entire ecosystem with a lot of nutrients.
All right, so we have another question from Manny. Is there a type of logging practice that is not so damaging to the environment?
Yeah, there is. But the key difference is that we need to be, first of all, I said we need to be managing our forest this way. But part of it is we don't need to be managing them. Like, part of it is that indigenous relationship with the land, where you just let the land exist and you don't see yourselves as the ultimate masters of exactly what the land does. But that being said, the way you would manage a forest in a better way is you wouldn't manage it for the primary purpose of timber production, because when you're doing that, you're managing a tree farm. You're not letting an ecosystem be an ecosystem. So there are places where they've done ecoforestry, and this is not clear cutting at all. It's selective logging, where you have an old growth forest or something near an old growth forest, and you take a few trees and you let them grow back. And you do that on very long cycles, so that you never really destroy the forest. You just take individual trees out of it. And there's a forest that I would recommend you look into called Wildwood Eco Forest up in Courtenay, I believe, which is on Vancouver Island. And they've basically been logging a section of old growth forest for the past 100 years. And during that time, the amount of trees in that forest has gone up, and the trees are getting bigger and bigger. So they haven't plundered the resource. They've left it in a really good state. And that's what I would envision for forests in Washington State. If we manage forests that way, like we could, there's a lot of jobs in restoration of these areas. So you'd have to restore them to a good state. And in that process, there would be a lot of ways to produce sustainable timber. But the thing is, we wouldn't be producing it for world markets. We'd be producing it for Washington State and the surrounding areas in a localized system. It's not sustainable to ship these trees overseas perpetually to fund suburbs and on the other side of the world. In order to have a sustainable harvest, we need to have a lot less harvest. And right now, like those clear cuts, I've gone when they're cutting, and there are some cases where it's literally one guy in a big machine and he's just doing it himself, because it's so automated that there are almost no jobs out of this. If we were to restore forests into old growth, and you would need individual people going out there with chainsaws and cutting down a tree or a few trees and getting them out of there. And that has a lot more jobs. It's a lot more sustainable, and it's a lot better in terms of carbon. And it also leaves the entire ecosystem as an ecosystem. It might create little disturbances, but there's a difference between disturbances, if you know that in ecology, where it's like, there's a landslide and that's considered a disturbance. That's what the timber industry says clear cuts are. They said they're just a disturbance, but they're not. They're obliteration. So a sustainable model of forestry would be selective harvest on very long rotation. So you only really go into an area once every 100 or so years and take some trees, not all of them, and then leave the area intact, and ideally have as few roads as possible, because roads are extremely bad for wildlife in terms of wildlife corridors. They fragment the region. They create landslides, they silt streams. They're pretty awful. So it'd be minimal roads, minimal logging, and just essentially logging for the needs of the community in that particular area instead of the needs of cities in areas that don't even have forests. In areas, like my perspective is that if a city is in the middle of a prairie, they should be building with stone, not with wood. Because that's a local resource, and that's part of adapting to climate change is localizing. And right now, Washington State, California, and Oregon, and British Columbia are supplying world markets with timber. And that isn't sustainable for our community, and it's not sustainable to ship timber all the way to the other side of the world and then get it milled there and then ship it to some other part of the world. Localized timber is what would be sustainable.
Success in speaking of Washington specifically of private lands or warehouser managed tree farms being repurchased by the state for state control. Is there any possibility of that in that aspect?
Yeah, right now, the state really hasn't, there's been no effort to take private lands in front of the public, so I haven't really seen that. Right now, the biggest success that you see is taking state lands that are managed for timber and moving them into some classification where they're protected. So we have seen a bit of success in that, finding, the Center for Responsible Forestry, they do surveys of state timber sales, and if they find even like one old growth tree, that's enough to cancel the timber sale generally, because they sometimes include them accidentally and they're not supposed to. So you can kind of see areas like that where you create new protected areas from state lands, and there has been some success in that. But recently, most of the land has been managed with the explicit understanding that it's in what they call working forests, which aren't working forests, they're tree farms. And that's sort of the dominant paradigm right now. There's not been much of an effort to change that.
All right, so we have a question from Angeline in the chat. Do you have any ideas for a solution to prevent the constant cutting of trees in Washington in order to build things like houses? So hitting on the housing market in Seattle, where it's just build, lots of construction materials happening.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I said earlier. Washington has a lot of forests and they got logged, and most of it is exported. So if it was supplying simply Washington's timber needs, we could manage all of our forests pretty sustainably with a very slow rate of cut. However, the more systemic solution is we need to start building. We need to degrow. That's part of it, the degrowth conversation, where we shouldn't be building more houses because we shouldn't be building more suburbs, because if we build more suburbs, well, where are you building that? You're cutting down a forest, put it there, no doubt. So we need to be thinking in terms of climate change about a sort of a wartime mobilization, where it's like we need to figure out how to do more with less, and that's fundamentally it. You don't need a new deck, you don't need a new house. There's so much real estate in Washington State, and this is one of the things that's often overlooked in terms of the homelessness crisis. There's plenty of housing. It's just that it's monopolized by a certain sector of the population. There's a bunch of empty buildings that are sitting there as investments, and those should become housing. That's in terms of the housing crisis. We shouldn't be counting on building more suburbs that just expand our footprint and aren't built to be sustainable to begin with. Even despite what they're being built out of, they're being built to have propane and massive lot size, and they're built for a high consuming, high energy lifestyle, and that lifestyle, as we all know at this point, is not sustainable. So we need to be thinking about degrowth, in my opinion.
So Jan was wondering, this is two parts, if you have a website that I could put in the chat where people could read about a little bit more about your activism. And then she also wanted to thank you for the eye-opening presentation.
Wow. Yeah, thank you. I would recommend searching Fairy Creek Blockade in terms of if you want to read about the activism that's been going on. If you want to follow my personal stuff, you can follow my Instagram account. And I do have a website, it's called Universal Wildlands. It's kind of out of date. I would recommend just following me on social media and just, yeah, read about, look into these things, just search old growth forest every day and you can keep up with the news. You'll see, hopefully we'll have some news about owls soon. yeah, like the way I've done it is sort of just know your land base. Like go on Google Earth and start looking at areas and just start knowing like where you're from. You know, so many of us live, you know, in cities, but don't really realize what the context is. Like, what are the watersheds? And that's one of the most educational things that I've done. Is sort of figure out who owns some of the, you know, who owns your watershed, for instance. Like, is it public? Is it some private corporation? That's what I found really enlightening. And then yeah, just go to Google News and just search, you know, on a daily basis and just see what's happening in terms of our forests, because a movement is growing slowly in British Columbia. It's one of the most, I mean, it's one of the most exciting things in the world when somebody calls you from the blockade and is like, there are 3,000 people right here right now. And that happened to me when I was in college last year, and the border was closed, so I couldn't be there. But yeah, people were saying, you know, there's 3,000 people. So the massive movement up there, and here it's sort of, you know, it's building. It's percolating. There, you know, the former commissioner of the DNR is calling for an end to logging of forest lands in the next 20 years of public lands. And, you know, I think that should happen a lot sooner. And I think that calls are growing. And if we start exerting some pressure, as much as we can muster, we have a real shot at protecting millions of acres of land. We might not protect all of it. The private land is going to be a lot harder because that's going to need several $1 billion to buy out those private lands. But state lands, you know, they belong to all of us. They belong to the tribes, first of all. And many of those lands, you should go back to the tribes and should be managed by the tribes. And when tribes manage the lands, generally in Washington State at any rate, it would be for conservation. So that would be a goal.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joshua. That's all the questions that we had in the chat box. But I want to thank you for taking the time with us today to share your knowledge and your experience. I hope that everyone here takes what they've learned in this session and is inspired to take action and engage in meaningful conversations with friends, family, neighbors, and colleagues, anyone you run into. If you're on campus, the Faculty Commons is now hosting a meet and greet with Joshua in D104. So come on down, join, have a conversation with Joshua. Everyone's welcome. And I just want to thank everyone else for joining this Earth Week session. Make sure to check out our online schedule, which I've posted in the chat. For the rest of the Earth Week events today, they're all on campus. We have a zines workshop where you'll learn how to tell a story through your own creative publication, an intro to hiking and backpacking with the Wellness Center, and a Repair What You Wear workshop to learn how to mend clothes with handy techniques like the Chico, and you'll get your own travel repair kit. So thanks everyone for coming. Hope to see you at another Earth Week event. Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you.